Okay, now in this section we're going to talk about language informants and how they are going to be used in our language. Important. They're going to make you speak the language well in ways that you right now can't imagine can happen. Finding the right informants is helpful. Now, if you were to read the LAMP book, from which actually much of this material I'm sharing with you comes from, you'll find that they use the word helper. It's really the same thing. The one thing that we want to do, though, is to avoid the idea that they are going to be your instructor. We'll get into that in a second. Now, don't start out with the assumption that an informant will work with you for a long time. With each informant that you begin to work with, explain that you'd like to get together maybe 3 to 5 times and to work on language. And that lets you later on, after a few times, if you determine that this is not the right person, you can easily end that relationship and you're not committed. Similarly, you may find that the person is a good person, but that you want another one as well. And particularly if you're working in a culture where there's not a lot of financial resource, that can cause a little bit of grief. So make sure that they know that this is not going to be a long-term thing, potentially. It might be. Now, work schedules, pay, and other expectations that you're going to be dealing with should be governed by the informant's culture, not yours. Now, for example, you may find that in your culture they want to work with you from 5 to 7 p.m. and in your home culture that's the dinner hour. And what many of us do is we say, well, we can't schedule that time because we're already going to be having dinner. Well, in that culture, if they eat dinner from 7 o'clock on, just get used to it now and adjust your schedule accordingly. I would also just note that gender choices as an informant are very important in some cultures, and so be careful to make sure that you're following the lead there of what the culture would say is an appropriate relationship. One of the keys here is availability. You need that informant to be available for you. You're going to want to work with them, if not every day, close to every day. For example, in our case, we had next door neighbors that had older teenage kids, and we arrived in the early part of the summer, and they basically were around for us 24/7, and we could basically walk next door and talk to them anytime we wanted to, and it was a very good situation in terms of the informant situation with availability. Finally, just again, I mentioned this in the first video, but beware dialects and accents. Now, this is particularly true if you're working in a large language, for example, Arabic, where you might be learning to speak Arabic in, I don't know, Jordan, and you're going to be actually using the Arabic in, let's say, Morocco. Now, if you're in that situation, you might want to try to find people that are from the culture you're eventually going to be wanting to speak the language in, because there is quite a bit of difference there. You should be asking probing questions to make sure that your informant speaks the language that you want to learn. A couple thoughts on working with informants. The first thing is that you are in charge of your language learning time, not the informant. It's very rare that you're going to find informants who are going to let you run the show. Most of them feel, hey, I'm the expert in the language, you're going to learn from me, and they will get directive with you about how to learn that language. And usually that means they're going to want to start with, vocabulary lists and grammar and that kind of a thing. So you need to, from the very beginning, set the stage that you are in charge of the time. One of the ways to make that happen is come to your informant session with a very good plan of what you plan to do together. When they see that list of things that are all written out and you're keen to get that list done, it helps to take over as opposed to giving them the lead to push things through. Another thing that can be tricky is your informant needs to feel free to correct your use of the language. In cultures where there is high deference given to, for example, educated foreigners, what you'll find is that your informant doesn't feel comfortable telling you, no, that's wrong, do it this way. And so you're going to want to make sure that the informant that you're working with has a lot of freedom and are okay to correct your language when you speak it. And particularly if it's male-female, if it's old or younger, that kind of thing can be problematic in some places, so be careful of that. The informant, I'm sorry, I wrote information, but the informant needs to know that when he or she speaks, particularly on recordings, they should use natural language. Now, if you noticed in the first video session that I did, number 1, I gave the English phrase and I did not use natural language. Now that's a big no-no and my mistake. I think the phrase I used was, I am learning to speak English, and I paused between words. It's very common that when we speak with someone who doesn't understand our language, we slow down that language and we add pauses, as if that helps. It really doesn't help for the most part. What we want to do is encourage our informant to use a natural, easy style of language speaking so that they are not stilting or changing their language for us. Now, when it comes to directing informants, it really does help if your informant can write. You should come prepared in the session with paper and pens so that when you get into drills in which you want to point to a particular phrase, for example, you can write those things out and you can point to them. Now, you may or may not know the alphabet of the language that you're working in. You should be working on that alphabet so that as soon as possible, as you're writing things out, you're able to use actual written text. I don't really cover that in any of these sessions, but you should be working on that too. I would also just remind you that if someone says to you as an informant, hey, let's meet at the coffee shop, which would be very common, for example, where I learned to speak Serbo-Croatian, that's fine, but the setting is not always then suitable for recording, and you're definitely going to want to record in your informant sessions. And so show up to a spot where you know you'll have some privacy, or at least the sound levels are such that you can record that language. And again, you're listening to this language, so it's got to be very, very clear. Now, how about a little bit of philosophy? Am I suggesting that we're going to only be working with informants? Heavens no. If there's a language school, you should go to it. The first 2 years that I was learning Serbo-Croatian, I went to language school approximately 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. It really helped. If you want to have a formal tutor, like a teacher, that's going to work with you one-on-one, then you should do that. If you want to buy the local grammar book, you should do that. If you can do a homestay, which is a highly beneficial thing, particularly as you enter the culture, that's a great way to get language down. But in spite of all these things you're going to do, language is spoken, and you need to be the one speaking it, not just sitting and absorbing or reading or being told what to do. And so this idea of a daily learning cycle, which we're going to be talking about, is going to be the foundation for how you're going to learn this language. All the rest of the stuff we just talked about, that's just gravy. It gets added to the mix and makes things go a little bit faster. But that learning cycle and you going after the language is really the key.